I now recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratcliffe, I think Dr. McCormick was on to the right question. It seems to me the fundamental question is why? Why did they lie to us? And why is it taking so long? You point this out in your testimony. Why is it taking so long for every government agency to admit what we all know? Because belief in a lab leak as the origin of, as the start of this, is not a conspiracy theory, is it, Mr. Ratcliffe?
No.
Why is it taking so long then? I mean, you knew that early on, right? If I look at you, you knew that you were confirmed, I think, in May of 2020, and you knew that within weeks that this thing came from a lab. In fact, you say that, I think, in your testimony. You say a lab leak is the only explanation, only credible explanation. If this were a trial, the preponderance of the evidence is all on the side of the lab leak. You knew that within weeks. So why did the government not tell us the truth?
Well, I think, you know, when you look at the intelligence community report that the Biden administration put out in October of 21, they acknowledge that China's refusal to cooperate, but the report in any way ignores what I think is the inescapable fact and reality that if the CCP had anything exculpatory, anything at all, anything that would be helpful to showing that no one was to blame for this, right, that this occurred naturally, that they would share that. And, you know, why not share data, samples, research, everything that tends to show that they had access to, that would tend to show that this was naturally occurring and tend to show that lab leak theory really was a conspiracy theory. But they didn't do that because they couldn't do that. And to me, that's why making an assessment with some level of confidence is something that should have been done a long time ago by the intelligence community. Yeah, we need to protect sources and methods. It's why Mike Pompeo and I labored over how much of this can we put out, hoping that it would drive the next administration coming in to declassify more information, which they haven't, and would drive congressional hearings into the origins of this, which it didn't.
Here's what gets me. So the director of national intelligence knew this thing came from a lab. The Secretary of State knew this thing came from a lab. Common sense tells you this thing came from a lab. And frankly, even the guys who called us names knew it came from a lab because we have their emails. We have their emails from the start. Mr. Gary says, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. Mr. Anderson says, this is not consistent with evolutionary. Everyone knew at the get-go. You knew at the get-go. And yet, they tell us just the opposite. Why?
Well, you left out the top public health official, a virologist, Dr. Redfield.
Dr. Redfield knew. He's testified, yes.
Also testified. So you did. You had the top diplomat, the top of the intelligence community, the top public health official, all telling you with some confidence level that the most likely origin of this was a lab leak. And I think that, you know, unfortunately for political reasons and political narratives, it was difficult.
So did you talk with Dr. Fauci during this time frame when you get in May and over the next several months? Did you talk to Dr. Fauci anytime?
No.
Never spoke with Dr. Fauci?
No.
Do you find that strange when he's out saying something directly contrary to the Secretary of State, to the Director of National Intelligence, and to the top virologist, Dr. Redfield, that Dr. Fauci wouldn't talk with you?
Yeah, to be clear, there were folks within the coronavirus task force that were communicating, you know, medical and scientific information to the intelligence community, not me directly, but none of that information was frankly consistent with what we've talked about, what the intelligence showed. Again, some of those individuals, to include Dr. Fauci, were promoting the idea that this was natural origins, and notwithstanding you know, the language that was read, they were referring to it publicly as a conspiracy theory in certain conversations.
Dr. Collins called us conspiracy theorists if you believed in the lab as the origin. Tell me why do you think Fauci and Collins took that? I got my theory, and I think I'm right, but I'd like to hear from the Director of National Intelligence what he thinks Fauci and Collins' motivation for sharing false information with the American people.
Well, I think the best evidence of that is their own conversations, which say that they didn't want unwarranted or unwanted, or I think the term was unwanted attention to the relationships that were taking place between Western virologists and those working within the Wuhan Institute of Virology and funding sources for some of that research.
Our money to a lab in China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing came from. That's what they didn't want us to know. You agree with that, Mr. Ratcliffe?
I do agree with that.
That's important. Thank you. I yield back.
Recognize Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like, for the record, to address something that one of our colleagues across the aisle was talking about, which was Asian hate in reference to President Trump. President Trump never spoke any language of racism or hate. He did, however, call, and many of us have called the COVID-19 virus the Wuhan flu, the China virus, because we feel it originated from China. I'd like to also state for the record that many viruses and diseases are named after the area that they come from, like the West Nile virus from West Nile, Uganda, Rocky Mountain spotted fever from the Rocky Mountains, Marburg virus from Marburg, Germany, Zika fever from the Zika forests of Uganda, Japanese encephalitis, German measles, and I could go on and on and on. We're really tired of the racism and name-calling, and it needs to end. But we're really talking about the origins of COVID-19 here today, which is shocking to me because, honestly, we've been talking about the origins of COVID-19 for 3.5 years. And every common-sense American that I know pretty much understands where it came from. Came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and doesn't really care if the intelligence community says it did or didn't. I would like to point out that here we are. The intelligence community is able to figure out immediately who was leaking classified information in a Discord chat, but yet still doesn't want to say whether it came from the lab or didn't come from the lab. The intelligence communities seem to release or not release information based on how the information will affect the government that it seems to protect. Yet, unfortunately, so many times it doesn't release or not release the information the people that it serves and I'll remind everyone is paid for by the taxpayers of America. I would like to point out that the State Department fact sheet on January 15th, 2021 knew a lot of information about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that means our intelligence community knew a whole lot more before that. They knew the U.S. government believes that there were several researchers inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick in the autumn of 2019, before the CCP first reported cases of COVID-19. They also knew that the CCP was preventing journalists, investigators, and global health authorities from accessing the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They also knew that starting in 2016, well before this, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was researching the bat coronavirus with the closest relationship to SARS-CoV-2, 96.2% similar. The Wuhan Institute of Virology has published record of dangerous gain-of-function research. And the State Department memo also said that the U.S. government determined the Wuhan Institute of Virology collaborated on publications and secret projects with the CCP military since at least 2017. And you know what else we know? We know that Dr. Fauci in the NIH funded through grants Eco Alliance with the gain-of-function research. We know that for a fact. Our government paid for it. Our taxpayers, unfortunately, unknowingly, paid for it. So we know all this to be true, and we know it was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Mr. Lowenthal, with your dedication to being an analyst of information, why is it so hard to determine whether COVID-19 came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or not?
Because the Chinese will not give us access to the information that we need. If they gave us the kind of access that Mr. Feith was talking about, if they gave us samples, if they gave us access to their records, and you will never be sure with the Chinese whether they're giving you the access that you want, we're never going to be able to say with a high degree of certainty. It's not. May I respond to something else that you said in your comments, Ms. Green? There is a vast, vast difference between tracking a leak on a social media site and determining the origins of this disease. And to compare the two is entirely fallacious, ma'am.
Dr. Lowenthal, you've said that you keep your intelligence claims and information nonpartisan. In 2018, Mr. Lowenthal, you were quoted in the New York Times saying that President Trump is the best president that Russia ever had. That sounds pretty political to me.
But I was no longer an intelligence officer at the time, ma'am. I'm a private citizen.
Well, I think you have a difficult time keeping your political opinions out of your political analyst. Mr. Ratcliffe, you are quoted as saying, to this day, the CIA, unquestionably the world's premier spy agency with an unrivaled capacity to acquire information and near limitless resources to do so, has continued to state that it does not have enough information to make any formal assessment. To put it bluntly, this is unjustifiable and a reflection not that the agency can't make an assessment with any confidence, only that it won't. Could you elaborate, please, Mr. Ratcliffe?
Well, I've talked about the overwhelming evidence on and intelligence on one side of the ledger that supports that the lab leak is the only plausible assessment at this point in time, and that conversely, that there really at this point isn't anything that ties COVID-19 to nature. I talked about the fact that no environmental source, no intermediate host, no reservoir species, nothing has ever been published that COVID-19 existed in any animal or species before the pandemic began. We make assessments all the time in the intelligence community with a fraction of the intelligence that we have available to us here. Again, I think this is a matter of won't, not can't, and I think that that it's unjustifiable when we're talking about 1 million Americans dead and as many as 10 or 15 million worldwide, and this contradiction that the current administration is taking through the intelligence community, and that you've heard here today, that we'll never know the answer to this unless the Chinese cooperate, is a contradiction with those that say our goal here is also to prevent a future pandemic. We'll never be able to prevent it if we don't get the answers that we need with respect to how this happened in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. I think it's an issue of won't, not can't as well. And perhaps we need to look deeper into whether was China trying to sway possibly an election, a presidential election, or was it some type of bioweapon?
Thank you.